ready to go.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you all had an action-packed morning with Dr. LaRoche. I'm sure you got plenty of sage information around the search and enjoyed her conversation about the perspectives on the digs that she's been on in her lifetime. She is really a purveyor and a preserver of American history. So I know you had a great time with her this morning. And we are kicking off the afternoon live from George Washington's Mount Vernon. We've been here since 10:30, so that's where I was this morning, getting acquainted with the property and really talking to our resident historians, curators, and really caretakers of history. And I'm going to introduce Jesse and Alyssa, who are going to talk to us today for a little bit, and then we're going to go on the move, on location. Y'all know my style. We're moving and shaking on the camera. I believe you're going to hear from Alyssa first around the educational programs and opportunities for teachers for professional development and learning and enhancing your classroom experience here at Mount Vernon. So,
hi everybody. My name is Alyssa Oginski. I'm the manager of teacher learning here at George Washington's Mount Vernon, which means I'm responsible for teacher professional development. Just coming from a meeting where we're developing new classroom resources for the fall, so I do dabble in that a little bit as well, but I get the very unique and special job of focusing on teachers, teacher needs, and what you need for professional development. And so we have an umbrella organization, that's a strong word, but it's called the George Washington Teacher Institute, and our programs for teachers run through that. So if you see George Washington's Mount Vernon or George Washington Teacher Institute, that's us. And so we're here to provide teachers with opportunities to come learn on-site and digitally about George Washington, the enslaved community, life in the 18th century, plantation life. We use primary sources, we dig in, and we do all the things that you would hope to do at a museum with historical sites, but specifically for teachers. And so I'm just gonna run through a little quick list. I put some slides together, which I understand will be shared with you. And so definitely look at those. And I just want to plug at the beginning, the best way to remember and understand all of these opportunities is to join our newsletter. So if you just go on our website, mountvernon.org, you type in education newsletter, it'll come up. And that way you can get the most up-to-date information. So starting with professional development, which is my arena, we host summer residential programs, which means we bring teachers from all over the country to Mount Vernon to study with us for 5 days each. We run 6 programs a summer. We've got 2 more still yet this summer, so we're working hard over here too. This summer we have 150 teachers from 43 states with us, and we'll hopefully have you all at some point too. Maybe some of you are even alumni of the program, and if so, hello. We miss you, and you can come back. So those are our big bread and butter programs where we provide teachers the opportunity to come learn on site with experts like Jesse and all the teams. We have archaeologists as well, and so we love those. Those are our big main programs, but we do try to provide PD to teachers year round. For instance, this fall we have a digital symposium on teaching Martha Washington in the 18th century coming up. It's 2 days, October 22nd and 23rd. Registration's open soon. We do provide that newsletter where we try to touch base about programming with reminders, but also some of the resources that might be useful in your classroom. Let's say around Constitution Day coming up in September. You know, I know it's the summer and you're working hard and you don't want to think about things like that, but we've got resources here to support you. And even for our local teachers, I understand some of you in the DC, Maryland, Virginia, even like Delaware area, we have local workshops. For instance, this fall coming up, we have 2 STEAM workshops where we'll visit the Gristmill Distillery together, we'll eat dinner together, we'll do all that fun stuff. So we've got some digital and some on-site programming throughout the rest of the year as well. We'll always be at big conferences like our NCSS and NCHE conferences, so please come and say hi to us. We have awesome student programming too, so I'll sort of shift my lens here. We have amazing student learning opportunities. For instance, you can schedule distance learning programs where our interpreters will come and talk to your class virtually. We've got a new Student of the Year awards. If you, I know you're not sure what you're walking back into this fall. That's like the big fear of the fall. It could be like the best class ever or the worst class ever. So it's a little terrifying. But in the instance that you want us to teach your students for an hour, you can sign up for our distance learning programs. We've got National History Day resources for your students, lots of curated web pages to help better understand content in the 18th century, like the presidency and, like I said, the Constitution, the enslaved community, slavery in the 18th century, which I know Jesse will talk a little bit more about, and some fantastic resources like that. We have a virtual tour. The last exhibit we had on at Mount Vernon was Lives Bound Together. It's a virtual exhibit now. Use those spaces, learn with place, even if you can't be here. But if you can be here, be here. And so we've just got such like a ton of stuff. Our offices, our K-12 offices are over in the Washington Library, and actually Jesse's is as well. I like to try to stay close to the scholarship. We have digital encyclopedia, podcasts. Check it all out. I could go on and on and on, but I just encourage you, think of us as a historical site. Think of us as a place to learn content. Think of us as also a place for classroom resources and learning opportunities for you and your students.
Wonderful. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. I can't stay, but I'm
sorry. Just like any teacher, we are always on the go. On the go. All right. So we're going to shift gears to Jesse. We had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Jesse already. I'm just going to kind of introduce the conversation. Jesse has a wealth of knowledge about all things Mount Vernon. Any question I asked her, she actually had an answer for me and was ready to go. But I'm going to formally introduce her. Jessie McLeod is an associate curator at Mount Vernon, where she has worked since 2012. She is the lead curator for the landmark exhibition Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and a contributor to the accompanying publication. She is also responsible for developing special exhibits across the estate, managing Mount Vernon's collections of historic prints, and researching the mansion's 18th century furnishings. And I mentioned to Jesse, we were talking a lot about this idea of mapping the search and really using portraits and art and even all the aspects of the humanities to tell a common memory of the founding of our nation and really the continued history. I do consider Jesse a holder and a partner in the search. Today, we had an opportunity to visit the Ona Judge Thames marker that is really close to the front entrance of Mount Vernon. So if you get to come here with your kids, check it out, teach a lesson there. It's enough space actually on the grass to do a lot of things in that space. But I definitely want to introduce Jesse and just ask her a few questions, and then we will go on the move. So welcome, Jesse, to the Institute. We are so happy to have you and thankful that you took the time out to talk to our teachers today. So I guess my first question, I think I've mentioned we're on the week that we titled Mapping the Search. And thinking about this idea of space and place, as Alyssa actually introduced, that was a perfect introduction to this idea of learning in place and space and in natural environments. Here at George Washington's Mount Vernon, I know you had an opportunity to curate and really vision the Lives Bound Together exhibition. And curation as caretaking is one of our key points of learning through the Institute. Can you talk to us a little bit about the exhibition and really your process as a creative historian and really a holder of history?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. I'm thrilled to be a part of this. This is such a wonderful program. And yeah, so the Lives Bound Together exhibition opened in 2016. It was the first large-scale exhibition on slavery that Mount Vernon had mounted. So we had information about slavery presented on site. There was research that had been done, but it hadn't been presented in the format of a large-scale exhibition. So that was a really exciting opportunity to really tell the stories of the individuals who were enslaved here, the contributions that they made to the Mount Vernon plantation, and what their lives were like, on a daily basis. And we organized the exhibition around the theme of biography. So we had 19 individuals who we commissioned an artist to create life-size silhouettes of them. So of course we don't have images of most enslaved people, unfortunately, but we wanted to present them as human beings. So we had these silhouettes, and they were accompanied by a digital touchscreen that had information about their lives. And then they were placed throughout the galleries in sections with information that related to their story. So we had Ona Judge in a section that talked about resistance and the ways that enslaved people pushed back against George Washington's authority in various ways. So we really wanted to kind of bring forward the stories of all of those people who were crucial to Mount Vernon's functioning. You know, in 1799, there were 317 men, women, and children enslaved here on the property. That was more than 90% of the residents of Mount Vernon.
Wow.
So if you think about who was here and the faces that you would have seen walking around, you know, one of my colleagues likes to say that this was a Black neighborhood that the Washingtons happened to live in the middle of. And, you know, if you think about it in terms of numbers, not in terms of power, but in terms of numbers, that was true. So really bringing those stories forward and getting people to think about this place differently. Think about who provided the labor that allowed George Washington to go off and serve in the Revolution, go off and serve as president. Who were the ones who were generating the profits that helped make him such a wealthy member of Virginia society? You know, it was these people who had no choice but to labor for his benefit. So we really wanted to get, you know, those stories out there and help visitors kind of relate to them on a more personal level.
So what was the process when you, like, can you think back on the first day of like, okay, I know this is happening, you know, and as a historian or researcher, like that's a time where I'm like usually sick in my stomach. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Can you talk to us about your process just as a creative and historian when you were thinking about Lives Bound Together?
Yeah, oh gosh. Well, it's a long process to bring an exhibit like that together. So the exhibit was about 4,400 square feet,
Wow.
7 galleries, and we started thinking about it in 2013, so about 3 years before it opened. So it was quite a long process. And as I mentioned, there had been a lot of research that had been done on the topic. I have a colleague, I guess now former colleague, she recently retired, Mary Thompson, who wrote literally the book on slavery at Mount Vernon. If you're interested in learning more, her book is a great resource. So she had, you know, this incredible body of research. So we had a lot of the information, and we're fortunate that Mount Vernon as a site has a lot of documentation. As you all know, many sites don't have a lot of information about the people enslaved there. We do, relatively speaking. So we are fortunate in that respect. So it was really a question of how do we shape that information into a narrative? How do we organize it? And I think that's where, as we were thinking about that, the idea of using the lens of biography and telling the story through these individuals really came forward, because we do have that information, and it's so rare to be able to have a name and really be able to trace somebody's life, in some cases from birth through death. So we really wanted to showcase that. So very early on, that framework was really at the top of our minds. We also, of course, have a lot of material culture, which is, the primary way that we, or a primary way that we learn about the 18th century here at a historic site. We have the landscape and the buildings, as well as you mentioned, the artwork and the furnishings. In the case of the enslaved community, we have a lot of archaeology that's been done over the past 30 years that reveal what people had in their homes, what they were eating, objects that they acquired for adornment, things like beads and buckles that, likely had great meaning for people who weren't able to own many, many things. So we were able to present those objects in order to kind of tell this full story of the people who were enslaved here. And an additional thing that we did with material culture, that was another kind of early idea that we made sure to include, was to think about every artifact here on the site as an artifact of slavery. So, obviously the archaeology from the quarter where enslaved people were living is, directly linked to the enslaved community, but, a chair in the front parlor of the mansion, who was moving that chair around? Who was cleaning the slip cover that they put on in the summer to keep the silk upholstery from getting sweat on it? Who was dusting it in the mornings? Almost every object in the house was touched, moved, cleaned by an enslaved person. So we can use those objects to tell their stories as well. It's not a separate story, it's integrated into the narrative of this place. So we really wanted to make sure we got that across.
Yes, absolutely. This idea again of a common memory. I know as we were walking this morning, we kind of shared with you one of the quotes that kind of excited me as a researcher, that the highest point in democracy is the right to be seen. And then we talked about erasure quite a bit. That is another common theme in the ways that we are going on the search within this institute. Can you talk to me a little bit about how erasure of enslaved people shows up or has shown up in your research as well as here at Mount Vernon?
Yeah, well, certainly, even though the stories, as I was just saying, of enslaved people are embedded in this site and in the objects here, they were not always told. And it's been an effort over the last 10 to 20 years to really bring those stories to the forefront. And I think that really goes to show how the narratives that are taught, are presented at historic sites, are the products of very particular visions of history, and often have particular agendas. And we have an opportunity now to change those narratives and to make them more inclusive and to bring enslaved people back into the story of Mount Vernon as essential players, both at this place and also in American history. So we want to make sure now that people who come to Mount Vernon, of course they're going to learn about George Washington, and that is important, but they're also going to learn about the people who made his life possible and who also lived their own lives and are worthy of our attention and study, in their own right. So our goal is to really kind of bring those forward and craft a new narrative that really is more inclusive and diverse.
Absolutely. It's a great segue into my next question. I know we were looking at some of the exhibits that we'll see. We're about to go on the move. But talk to me about the evolution of language. I know we were talking about that, and that's a common theme that's coming up as we continue the search and really looking at our work as educators and the ways that we talk about certain things. Can you talk to me a little bit about the evolution of language around the exhibits?
Yeah, so that's definitely something within the last decade or so that has evolved in the museum world generally and here at Mount Vernon. We have shifted to using enslaved people rather than slaves because slavery was a condition, not an identity. It was imposed by others. It wasn't essential to a person. So saying enslaved person, emphasizes that it was imposed. And we actually explain that at the beginning of all of our tours. Every person who goes through the house hears, we say enslaved person, and this is why. So that's been a big one.
Wow.
There are other little things. I think it's tricky because a lot of the sources we have, the primary sources, are from George Washington's perspective, and I think historically there's been a tendency to kind of, by default, take his perspective. But there are ways in which we can read against the grain, and if you see a source where Washington's complaining about enslaved people, not working efficiently, years ago somebody might have concluded that they were being lazy, but today we can say no, they were deliberately resisting Washington's authority and kind of reclaiming time and labor that was being stolen from them through the system of slavery. So that's maybe not necessarily language, but more kind of how we interpret historical sources. And there are other things like instead of saying runaway, saying freedom seeker, little things like that I think as people read them might make them say like, oh, that makes me think about this differently. That kind of sheds new light on this idea.
So for you, just personally, I guess it was a personal and professional, what was one of those moments in curating this exhibit where you're like, whoa, like this just changed me as a person? Because we want, if it's not personal, particularly anything that we do as creative people, like it's not long lasting or enduring. So what was one of those moments for you as you were curating this exhibit?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind is actually kind of at the tail end of the process at the exhibit opening, which we had, we had something at the exhibit itself, but we also had kind of a big celebration ceremony in a tent that was on the lawn right in front of the house. So you could kind of see the house in the background. And we had this group of young people doing African dance. And they were doing it in front of the house. And I just had this moment of thinking like, could George Washington ever imagine
Wow.
that there are these, beautiful young people, doing these incredible movements with his house in the background? It just made me feel like how far have we come that we're able to like center these voices and center this story in a way that I think a lot of people never would have expected or thought possible. So that gave me goosebumps.
Absolutely. And I guess another question in that same line, what's next for you? What's next for the exhibit? What's next for some of the things that we're going to see? Because we talked a little bit about them as we did our preliminary kind of walkthrough. So what's next for them to look forward to?
Yeah, so right now the exhibit has closed, and we have a new exhibit that is a history of Mount Vernon that incorporates the story of slavery, but also looks at kind of the history of the site more broadly from kind of indigenous people living here all the way up to today. So the story is still being told in the museum, but we're also working on bringing the content that was in the Lives Bound Together exhibit across all areas of the estate. So we're updating some of the signage and some of the outbuildings, the service buildings, the quarters, to reflect, things like those language changes that we talked about. Some of those things haven't been updated in, 10 to 15 years, so there are things that we can do. The most exciting thing, which is very recent, is that there's a portion of that, of the greenhouse slave quarter building that we're going to be going into. We won't be going into this part of it, but we will go into that building. There's a portion of it that used to be a retail shop up until a few months ago, which was problematic, to say the least.
Interesting.
And we finally, after a lot of internal discussions, were able to, get permission to phase out that as a retail space. And we'll be turning it into an interpretive center for programming relating to the enslaved community, as well as a small exhibit, probably kind of a smaller version of Lives Bound Together. So right now we're kind of developing a proposal for that and thinking about, how that will play out. So that's probably what I'm most excited about.
Great. So can you let our scholars know how long has George Washington's Mount Vernon been a historic site? Because we have, I can't say everyone, I have this vision of George Washington's Mount Vernon like just existing in this one moment in time in history when, again, I'm walking around here today in its current time. Can you talk to us about how long this area has been a preservation area and really an area that's to educate?
Yeah, so this is one of the oldest historic sites in the country. It began operating as a museum in 1860, so it's been over 160 years. After Martha Washington died in 1802, the estate passed to George Washington's nephew because they didn't have any biological children, and then to several other kind of collateral descendants, other nephews and great nephews. And then by the 1850s, the house was really falling into disrepair, and a woman named Pamela Cunningham founded the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to raise the money to purchase it and preserve it as a museum. So in the 1850s, they were raising the money, and then they were finally able to purchase the property in 1860.
Wow.
So it's a really interesting institution.
That number blew me away.
Yeah.
160 years of the preservation of history and really the opportunity to come to place and learn in an intentional way. So that 160 years is a long time. So definitely try your very best to get here to visit. I'm learning so much just in the short time that we've been here today. So we are about to go on the move. I'm going to thank our crew as well as Jesse in advance because we're going to cover a lot of ground. Alrighty. So stay tuned. We're going to have a brief little transition and we will be on location.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, we're live.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. So I'm standing right now outside the Greenhouse Slave Quarter, which is a building that was constructed or completed in 1792. This replaced a quarter that was just adjacent to this building. That was the primary quarter for enslaved people from the 1760s to the early 1790s. And this building is really interesting because it's very much a two-faced structure. So these two wings, and we'll see the other one in a moment, are housing for the enslaved community. And then the central portion is actually a greenhouse. And you get a good sense of this from the other side, and we'll walk around that way. But the greenhouse is kind of visible to the public, very beautiful, ornamental. This side was all about labor. This is where the work yard was. This is where the enslaved people were living, and this is part of Washington's effort to really keep the labor out of sight of his visitors and kind of segregate the landscape in a way that kept labor out of view. So we're going to go into a little exhibit space that we have in this building. So this map that you see here shows the 8,000 acre plantation that Mount Vernon was in the 1790s. Today we only have about 350 acres, so it was a much, much larger plantation, and a lot of that land is now commercially or commercially developed or residential developments. So unfortunately we don't have the entire property under our control any longer, but you can get a sense of the sheer scale of it. And these infographics show you the enslaved people who were stationed on each of the outlying farms. So the Mansion House Farm, which was where the Washingtons lived, is where we are today. And that's kind of Mount Vernon if you visited today. And then there were 4 outlying farms. And there were about 90 enslaved people who lived at the Mansion House Farm, and the remaining 227 were stationed on those outlying farms. And you had a lot of families who were separated across different farms. Washington, here at Mount Vernon, Washington dictated that work assignments would determine where you lived rather than family arrangements. So you had husbands and wives who lived in different places depending on what their work assignment was. We also have over here, I'll just point this out quickly, some archaeological material that was excavated from the site of that quarter that I mentioned. This shows things like plates, bottles, mugs, tobacco pipes, buttons, buckles, animal bones that give us a sense of what enslaved people were eating. So in the absence of documents written by enslaved people themselves, this is our best resource for understanding those details of their daily lives.
Can you show the picture of Hercules, and can you tell them a little bit about Hercules in this photo and some of the things that we talked about earlier? Because we use a lot of historic photos and of course archival texts and things as such, and many of us have seen this photo for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so we need to update this display for the reasons I'll detail. This is not Hercules, even though it has been used as an image of Hercules for a long time. And it's a little complicated a story, but essentially this painting is in a Spanish museum and it had been identified as George Washington's cook. We, in the context of the exhibition a few years ago, had a group of scholars and art historians and conservators come together to look at the painting, because we actually got the original painting on loan for the exhibit,
Wow.
which was really exciting. Well, it was exciting at the time, but it was an exciting opportunity to learn more about it. And so looking at it, we realized a few things. One, it had been attributed to Gilbert Stuart, who of course did the famous painting of George Washington. But looking at it in person, it was clear the style was very different from Gilbert Stuart. It also became clear that in looking at the costume or the clothing of the person, he's not a cook. That is not a cook's hat. For one thing, the classic tall white chef's hat didn't actually become a thing until the late 19th century, so well after Hercules was cooking. And this actually more closely resembles hats that were worn in the Caribbean by Black men there. So it's likely that there's some connection there. And then when you look at the history of the painting, it also becomes clear that it didn't originally have that George Washington connection. It seems like somebody added that in an effort to kind of make it seem more interesting.
Absolutely.
So for all those reasons, we realized, there's no reason to believe that this is actually Hercules.
And that's the search. So when we think about the ways that we instruct children around the search as a framework of inquiry for discovery, as well as for them to write their own stories, they have to look at everything and look at everything with an objective eye and, through the lenses of, okay, there has to be more than what I'm saying. There has to be more than what I'm seeing. And I think this photo is proof positive that, we have to do that, which is, again, one of those great things about the evolution of history and the evolution of us in our nation. I think we are always on the search.
And I'll just add one brief detail. Even though it was disappointing that the painting didn't turn out to be Hercules, that discovery actually prompted additional research that found that Hercules had ended up, after he ran from Mount Vernon, he had ended up in New York City, and somebody found him in records there, which had never been discovered before. And they actually found a record of his burial in 1812 at the Second African Burial Ground in New York City. And they found that he had worked as a cook in the early 19th century. So that discovery, even though it was, disproving something, it actually led to new research. So you never know where these roads will lead.
And that's mapping the search. I know Dr. LaRoche talked a little bit this morning about the African burial ground. So boom, here are we as historians, researchers, and educators smacking up against each other in our learning. And again, we are a community we're a community. We have to do history and life and build a common memory together.
So I mentioned that this was kind of a two-faced building, and this room is really representative of that. So this is a room where a disabled man named Peter, who Washington referred to as Lame Peter, was stationed to keep a fire going in the winter months in order to heat the greenhouse to make sure that Washington's tropical plants didn't die. So this is kind of the engine room of that space that we'll see on the other side. And really kind of a good symbol of how enslaved labor really made the beautiful world that the Washingtons constructed for themselves possible.
And I actually think that they might have had that room on High on the Hog, that Netflix special. I do remember the imagery of that. Yep, absolutely. It definitely was something. As soon as I saw it, I went, "Ooh, I've been in this room before."
So this is one of what were originally 4 bunk rooms in this building in the 2 wings on either side of the greenhouse that I mentioned. This is where a number of the people who were enslaved here at the Mansion House would have lived. This is possibly where Ona Judge lived when she returned to Mount Vernon from Philadelphia. It's also possible that she lived or that she stayed in a cabin across the lane from where we are, actually on the site of the building where we were sitting for the first part of this program. On that site, there were cabins for enslaved families. And unfortunately, that modern building was constructed before we had an archaeology program, so the site was not excavated in the way that we might do today, but we do know that there were cabins there. But somewhere in this immediate area is where Ona Judge would have spent her childhood and would have lived when she returned here.
We're showing you names for a reason because they're super important to, again, just with Tubman, when you go on searches for people, you have to search all aspects of them, different names, because you would naturally think that Harriet Tubman, you would be searching for Tubmans, but really you have to search for Rosses because Tubman was her married name. So really names and place are so important to understanding the breadth and the depth of an individual's life.
And this building is furnished with reproductions that showcase, you know, the types of things that enslaved women and children would have used in their daily lives. We have a little palette on the floor with a small homemade doll and some marbles. Marbles are something that have been discovered through archaeology, kind of a brief glimpse at, you know, moments of play that enslaved children or even adults might have found, you know, amid the drudgery of their daily lives. So now we're gonna walk around and we're gonna see the other side of this building. You can get a sense of what, you know, white visitors to Mount Vernon would have experienced when they came here. So this is the ornamental upper garden. There were two gardens here at Mount Vernon. This one was more for show, and then there was a kitchen garden that's kind of symmetrical to this one. And this is where Washington would have entertained guests. This was definitely meant to be a showpiece. And the greenhouse is over there in the center. It has extremely tall, almost two-story windows to let in the sunlight, and that's the space that would have been heated by the stove room that we just saw on the other side. But you can really get a sense that, you know, these two wings that housed the living quarters for the enslaved were not really visible. This space was not meant to be a site of work. This was really, you know, where Washington kind of separated the labor of enslaved people and what he considered kind of his pleasure ground. So this is kind of a stark example of that separation. And we know the names of the enslaved gardeners who were tending to these gardens. Harry and George were the primary gardeners. They worked under a hired English gardener in 1799. And, you know, they were tasked with, you know, pruning and growing all the flowers as well as vegetables. It was really, you know, a tall order, as you can imagine, looking at the scale of this space.
I'm definitely thinking about what we learned yesterday when we talked to Tony Cohen and the producers from Schoolhouse Farmhouse, that agriculture had a large role in freedom and in enslavement. So understanding the land and what needed to happen to work the land and make profit off the land, and even using the land for a source and a resource actually for freedom. It's a huge part of the story.
I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along.
Oh, yep, they're coming. Yep, they are definitely coming.
So here you can get a straight-on view of the greenhouse.
Fact, totally different narrative.
And I like to think about standing here, kind of the lives and experiences, the joys and the sorrows that were contained within those two wings with all the people who were living there.
Okay. It's bigger on there. Okay, I'm reading your question. So, are there any plans to update this to update the site? I'm in a glare. Plans to update the site to include enslaved experiences / narratives outside of just their names and labor.
Yeah, so we do in that interpretation include, things beyond just their names and labor, and we didn't get into a lot of the detail, but we have information about religious practices and family and community, and what people were wearing, how they forged their own identities through things like personal accessories or objects of adornment. So our goal is to not only talk about enslaved people in terms of their relationship to George Washington, but to honor their own humanity and to talk about them as people, as I said earlier, worthy of consideration in their own right. So we are always trying to update our interpretation to make sure that it is honoring that goal, but we do that currently as well.
Can you talk about the descendant relationship? Because I think this is like a great time to even talk about that as we move through.
Yeah, so we have a relationship with a number of descendants of enslaved people. They have recently, within the last year or two, formed their own group called the League of Descendants of the Enslaved in Mount Vernon, and so we're kind of forging a relationship with that group as well. But we've had relationships with individuals, over 20 plus years. And we worked closely with the descendant community as we were developing the Lives Bond Together exhibit, as well as with the exhibits that we just saw in the bunk rooms there. So it's always our goal to make sure that their voices are part of the process. And I think it's an ongoing, institutional challenge to make sure that we are, sharing authority with descendants and making sure that they're not just included kind of at the end of the process as a, trying to get them to sign off on what we've done without their input, but rather seeking input at the beginning. And so that's something that we're really trying to do as much as we can moving forward. There's a wonderful resource that came out of Montpelier a few years ago called, it's a rubric for engaging the descendant community in interpreting slavery at historic sites.
Wow.
I was fortunate to be part of the team that drafted that, and it basically has a set of kind of steps that you can take in a way to kind of assess yourself as an institution in terms of how well you're doing in kind of sharing that authority with descendants who of course have their own claim to this place as the site where their ancestors were enslaved. And so we take that very seriously, and it's something that we're always trying to improve.
Yeah. Two quick questions. Dr. LaRoche this morning mentioned geography as an instrument of oppression and freedom. Has research been done on the enslaved gardeners and who maintains the gardens today? So who maintained them before, any research on them, and then who does them now?
Yeah. So we know the names of the enslaved gardeners. Harry and George were the gardeners in 1799. Occasionally a man named Cyrus helped them as well. They were under the direction of the hired English gardener. But they were charged with maintaining, all of the space as well as the grounds around the mansion. And we do know about their families. Again, this is where Mount Vernon's incredible documentation is useful because we're able to really, put together a full picture of who these people were. So we do have information about them. And then today, Mount Vernon has a wonderful horticulture team that maintains all of the grounds, including the gardens. And they do research on historic plants and what was grown here in the 18th century. And so we're able to try to recreate the landscape as best we can.
One other quick question, and we can answer the third one as we walk. Any evidence that George or Martha Washington educated their enslaved or taught them Christianity?
No, there's no evidence, and in fact, there's counter evidence in Ona Judge's narrative at the end of her life when she specifically says, she never learned to read or write, and she was not taught religion either. So we do know that several enslaved people were literate. We don't know how they gained that knowledge, but there's no evidence that it was from the Washingtons.
Yep. And if you look at Dr. Dunbar's research, he talks about the process of Ona learning to read and write on her own.
Yeah.
All right, I guess as we walk, since George Washington was the wealthiest president, is there any discussion about reparations for enslaved people and their descendants from past profits and current profits?
Yeah, I'll be honest, no. I have not heard any discussions of that. I know reparations is a topic that is coming up more and more. I do think, the entity that operates Mount Vernon today is the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which is, a separate organization from George Washington's family. So in that sense, one could argue that it is not necessarily Washington's wealth that is preserving Mount Vernon today, but I'm sure there are counter arguments as well. So that's a really great question, and I think something that we'll, I'm sure, be addressing and thinking about more and more.
Thank you. That was really good walking and talking backwards.
Bring back my college tour guide.
Yes.
Absolutely. So we're approaching the mansion. So you can see kind of the main house where the Washingtons lived. This is where Ona Judge would have worked as Martha Washington's personal maid, which of course was a position she started at the age of 10 when she was still a child. She would have worked in the house until she left with the Washingtons to go to New York for the presidency. So about 5 years that were spent working here. And as I mentioned earlier, we like to interpret this space not only as the Washingtons' home, but a site of labor for people like Ona Judge. Their presence is just as important, and it's crucial that we think about the labor that went into making this house what it was.
90%. That was a startling stat today.
So you can see some scaffolding on the house, and you'll also see as we walk around, there's some other areas where you can see work being done. Because these are largely 18th century structures, there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining them, and we're constantly having to do restoration and preservation to make sure that we can preserve them for the future. So even though it's not as aesthetically pleasing, it is unfortunately necessary.
Absolutely. Another question came in. I know individuals that were born in the institution of slavery were often only given a first name. Was the name Washington provided to enslaved people that Martha Washington and George Washington owned?
No, we don't have evidence of that. There are a couple people who ended up using the name Washington after they were emancipated.
Wow.
But for the most part, people like Ona Judge who do have documented last names in the 18th century, and we don't always know where they came from. In the case of Ona Judge, it's almost certainly her father Andrew Judge. Yeah. In other cases, like William Lee, who was Washington's enslaved valet, he had been enslaved by the Lee family previously, so it was either that connection to that family, or his father may have been a white member of that family as well. So that's usually where you see the last names in the 18th century.
Yep, and you think about Sojourner Truth and, again, all the different perspectives and personas that her last name took, and those were pieces that she picked up to present herself in very different ways. So the reason for even having a last name, the reason in circumstances always vary, but what we do know is that most enslaved people were only given our first name.
And that's one area where it's tricky because, our records are from Washington, so he didn't record a last name, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people didn't have one that they either used or identified with. So I think that's something to keep
Again,
in mind as well.
That's the search. So how does one who is enslaved acquire or even select in some instances? We know that Truth selected her name. She got Bumfrey from her father's owner, but the other last names that she has taken on were self-selected or politically selected, depending on what she was doing in a public space. So again, another aspect of the search and another way to push kids into the archives, push them into historical documents.
And I think one great example of names and kind of how you can see some of those connections is there's a list that Washington made in 1799, which is this incredible snapshot of the enslaved community. It lists everybody who was enslaved here. It lists where they were living, who their spouse was, who their children were, what their age was, what their work assignment was. And you can see there, and I'll say we have evidence. It's pretty clear that by the latter years of Washington's residence here, enslaved parents were permitted to name their own children. And so you see on that list a number of boys and girls who are clearly named after either their parents or other relatives. And you can kind of make those family connections there and think about how that active naming was a way preserved to families.
Yeah.
So that is a really powerful tool. Just looking at that document and thinking about those details. So right now we're walking down the road towards George Washington's tomb, as well as the African American Cemetery and Memorial. To my right, there are fruit orchards, which I mentioned, Harry and George.
Thinking of even children's books, fruit references in books, children's books I know that I've read about George Washington.
Yeah, certainly the cherry tree is a classic.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I found a reference to Washington ordering that enslaved laborers cut down some cherry trees.
Oh, wow.
So he did, in fact, by extension, chop down cherry trees.
Or two.
So hopefully a moment ago you got a glimpse of the Potomac River. Mount Vernon is situated kind of up on a bluff next to the Potomac River. And that was an important part of the business of slavery here. Every spring, every able-bodied enslaved man on the property was recruited to go out on the river and catch fish. Those fish were then packed into barrels, salted, some of them were used for rations for the enslaved community here. Others were sold by Washington for profit. Many of them were actually sold the Caribbean, where enslavers there purchased them to feed their own enslaved workforce.
Comes, it's like I gotta hit a spot and stay there
We're back. Yep.
all day. So we're back. Okay.
So we are in the cemetery that was used by the enslaved community here. This is a site that we've grown to understand more and more over the last few years. You can see over here, there's the outline of string in the ground, which represents where they've located graves. They've been doing an archaeological survey of this site over the last few years, and they're going about 6 inches and we're still in the process as we in the future. But for now, they've discovered 87 graves in the site so far, and there are areas of the cemetery that we know were used that have yet to be surveyed. So this was a large-scale cemetery. We see some traditional practices such as bodies facing east, the feet facing east, as well as certain groupings that may indicate family groupings. There are also a number of graves of children, which speaks to childhood mortality in the 18th century, which was true for all children, but especially enslaved children who didn't have as good medical care and were not always supervised because their parents had to be working in the fields. And there's documentation here at Mount Vernon of
enslaved children dying as a result of accidents and things like that. So this site is a really poignant place to kind of think about, what a sacred space it would have been in the 18th century. This was a space where the community could come together. It was not overseen by the Washingtons in the way that almost every other part of the property was. It was a space for them. And we try to preserve that sense of sacredness. Every year we have a commemoration ceremony in conjunction with a local group called Black Women United for Action. They help us organize a ceremony where we honor the people who are buried here as well as all of those who were enslaved on the property. As you can see over here, we have a memorial here that was placed in 1983. This was actually the second memorial on the ground. The first is actually over to the side. That was placed in 1929. That memorial actually became overgrown, and in the early 1980s, a local reporter for the Washington Post discovered that, and thanks to her public awareness campaign, local citizens kind of pressured the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to erect a new, more prominent memorial. And this one was dedicated in 1983. It was designed by architecture students from Howard University. And it represents, it's a kind of pillar that's been cut off, and that represents the lives that were truncated by slavery. And around the base, you can't see them at the moment, but they're the words faith, hope, and love, which were the virtues that sustain those who were living in bondage.
Oh, you do. Yeah, the tape it.
Are there additional questions that I can answer?
Okay, so you see some coming in live? Okay, yep, that was it. Any questions?
Fortunately, those kind of became depressed over time and don't survive. So we're now, thinking about, how can we preserve the historical integrity of this place while also honoring its historical use and what it meant to the community. So there are a lot of, tricky questions that we have to consider as we're moving forward.
Can you talk about the reef laying and the yearly, I guess, observation of laying the reef?
Yeah, so every fall, usually in late September, early October, we partner with Black Women United for Action to have a wreath laying ceremony here. And it's a wonderful event. If any of you are local, I invite you to check our calendar on our website to see when it is and to come. It's free. You don't have to pay admission to Mount Vernon. It's free to the public. And, it's just a beautiful ceremony with music and dancing and the reading of the names of everybody who was enslaved here. And we also every day have a wreath laying here at the site because we have a wreath laying at George Washington's tomb, and this site deserves to be honored as well. And so a few years ago, we started having a wreath laying here, which is offered at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. And so we have, multiple ways that we're trying to make sure that we use this space to honor those who are buried here in the community more generally.
Any questions while we have, look, a nice solid, we're on a nice solid internet stream. Any questions about the burial grounds? And as we were entering, I'm not sure if we were buffering at that moment, there was an active site, literally. So this is an active space. So I encourage you to visit if you can.
And the archaeology team, the survey here has largely been done with volunteers. So if you're interested in actually participating, you have the opportunity to do that. So that's also been a wonderful thing about this site. We've had a lot of descendants who have come and participated, and I know it's been such a meaningful experience.
Any questions as we try to make our way into a space where we can have a clear feed? I try to take y'all everywhere, so bear with our technology. All right. You got the question now? I can see it better. All right. I'm in a glare, so I'm going to see. Okay, the question is, what was the nutritional health like for the enslaved at Mount Vernon? I thought I read somewhere that many of the enslaved at Mount Vernon were barely fed due to the sheer number of enslaved individuals here.
So the rations they received were pretty typical for a plantation in Virginia at the time. It was largely cornmeal and salted fish, and our research historian has done the calculations, and the rations they received amounted to about 3,000 calories a day, which, calorically is sufficient, but in terms of variety and getting the proper vitamins and minerals and nutrients in that sense, it was not sufficient. And that's where you see enslaved people often supplementing their diets on their own time. At the end of the day, they would have to keep personal gardens and hunt and fish and trap and forage. So those were things that were necessary in order to get sufficient variety to maintain good health. And that's the archaeological record shows us how people were doing that. So in that sense, it's not entirely true that they were barely fed, but in terms of the variety, it was certainly lacking.
Okay. Second question, any African traditions or religious practices evident on the burial ground?
So the main thing we see is kind of the orientation of the graves. Although that is common, there's similar practices in both African and Christian traditions. So it's a little hard to pinpoint. We don't necessarily see a lot of specific things. I think were we to excavate the actual remains, that might be where some of those things would emerge, but out of respect, we are not doing that currently. So there haven't been a lot of specific things. It's interesting because, while of course a lot of African customs and traditions did persist, the community that was living here, at least in the 1790s, many of them had been in the American colonies and then the United States for multiple generations. So there were not a lot of people who had come directly from Africa by that point, which is not to say, of course, that those traditions did not continue among the community here, but as I said, we haven't seen a lot of specific evidence of it.
Thank you. So Jesse pointed out that this area that we're in right now is an active site. So again, the search is ongoing, even today. All right, we're going to walk to the top of the hill. Hopefully we have better connection.
So this is George Washington's tomb where he and Martha are buried, as well as other Washington family members. And it's really interesting the proximity of this tomb to the cemetery. This tomb was actually constructed in the 1830s, well after Washington died. Um, so the cemetery was right there. And we don't know exactly why they chose this placement, or if it even disrupted some of the graves that were part of the cemetery. But it's an interesting feature of the landscape history of the site.
All right. So one final question, which was, are there any references on site about Ona Judge and the Washington's attempt to recapture or re-enslave her? Are there any counter narrative spaces where they present both perspectives on site?
Yes. So in our museum, Ona Judge is featured. We have a silhouette of her. We actually used the same silhouette that we had used in the Lives Spent Together exhibition. And we tell her story. We have an interactive touchscreen that has biographies of a number of enslaved people, and we tell her story there. Her story is also told in another exhibition space that we have. And it's a key part of the specialty tour focused on the enslaved community. And it's part of the training that every tour guide gets. So if somebody asks a question, it's something that they're prepared to answer. One challenge that we have in our house tour is that we get 1 million visitors a year, and often they only get about 60 to 90 seconds per room. So the amount of information that can be presented is limited. But we do have a directive that tour guides have to mention the name of an enslaved person in every single room of the house and talk about what they did in that space. So Ona Judge is also sometimes mentioned. They have leeway to determine kind of how they do that, but Ona Judge is often mentioned as part of the house tour as well.
All right. So that we asked our final question. You see, I'm sweating, so I do anything for the search and for the work that we do. Thank you all for tuning in. Jesse, again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for spending the day with us and really sharing your knowledge and really inviting us into George Washington's Mount Vernon. Thank you. We'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks.